Hello and welcome back to the Runaway Train Sports Podcast for another back-to-back finally week of releasing these episodes. I hope you all had a fantastic previous week. This is going to be a relatively short one since Purdue only had one game this week, and it was a less than exciting one down the stretch as Purdue falls to Minnesota this week. We're not going to go into too much detail about that game, but considering it's really the only thing that really happened this week, I think we're kind of left with no choice but to kind of touch on it at least a little bit. So, as I mentioned, Purdue traveled to Minnesota in the return game after handling Minnesota pretty reasonably well at Mackey Arena. The expectations were mixed about traveling to the barn to take on the Golden Gophers again. Purdue looked to have this one pretty well in hand down the stretch before, like Maryland, we'd seen in the past, a bit of a lack of execution down the stretch leads to Minnesota being in it, which when you're on the road in the Big Ten, you can't do that. Everyone can point fingers all they want, but when you're on the road in the Big Ten, especially it seems this year, you can't be going down the stretch with, a one possession lead. You really need to be able to build that out, that 2-3 possession lead, especially as you get down towards the final minute. Purdue ends up losing due to a Marcus Carr, I'm not going to say last second three, but it was a very late three when Purdue was up 2. That ended up a wild shot at the end of the shot clock that banks in. And I'm getting frustrated thinking about it, so we're not going to talk about it any more than that. And then from there, Trevion Williams is called for a travel on the ensuing possession when Purdue was only down 1 with about 10 seconds remaining. And that essentially is all she wrote. Purdue falls by 3, 71-68, and a frustrating one that felt like Purdue let slip away almost more than the Maryland game, it feels like, but definitely along the same vein. So, let's take a look at briefly just kind of hit the highlight stats. Trevion Williams, another fantastic game, going for 24 points, 10 rebounds. Jaden Ivey led Purdue in assists with 4. And I think the big story of this game was the 3-point line for Purdue. Purdue ends up finishing 2 of 17 from 3 for an astonishing 11.8%. Ooh, you are going to struggle mightily when you only shoot 12% from 3, especially on the road. And the fact that Purdue was in it as much as they were really goes to show, how well this team came to play. Other than that, it really, I mentioned Trevion Williams had a good game. Eric Hunter Jr. got to double figures with 14. And then Zach Edey also came out and had another fantastic game, finishing with 13. Other than that, there was a smattering of points here or there. It was a rough night out for the Boilers. But it was one of those interesting games where you look at the box score after the game was over, and you can go, ooh. Obviously a handful of guys had some pretty good games. Everyone else, besides Trevion, Eric Hunter Jr., and Edey, the closest anyone got to double figures was 5, and that was Mason Gillis and Brandon Newman. Jaden Ivey ends with 4. Aaron Wheeler ends with 2 on a lob, which was very, very fun, and transition from Eric Hunter Jr., and Isaiah Thompson has 1. That's it for when it comes to the scoring. With Trevion Williams obviously taking the heaviest load when it comes to the offensive side. Williams ends up with a double-double, and this was a game all about the big men. I think this is something we've seen from Purdue in years past, where when you're really struggling from the 3-point line, they really try and pound it inside. And this definitely is one of those cases, as both big men combined for 37 points and 12 rebounds. And were, fairly dominant down the stretch. That's not enough to get the job done. This was a game that, it was frustrating to say the least, especially as a Purdue fan. And really, I think even as a casual fan, this was probably a pretty rough one to watch. We don't have to go into too much more detail besides that, but that does leave Purdue at 13-8, currently 6th in the Big Ten with an 8-6 record, half a game behind Wisconsin and a half a game above Rutgers. So what does this mean going forward? Going forward, Purdue has currently scheduled 5 remaining games, 6 if they do end up rescheduling the Nebraska game, which there has been rumblings, but I don't think anything has been official as of yet. So taking a look next, we have Michigan State on Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central on the mothership of ESPN. And this is a game at home that Purdue needs to win. Michigan State has not been nearly the team that they've been in recent past, and I think their most recent outing, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think they've played since, was a 30-point drubbing at the hands of Iowa in East Lansing. Yes, they lost 88-58 at home to Iowa, who seemed like they finally decided they were done with losing and apparently just wanted to rain hellfire on the Spartans. So Purdue hosts Michigan State. This is a game, especially at home, and a reeling Michigan State that they need to come out strong, and they really need to put this game away early. This has not been something the team has been particularly good at. In fact, it kind of seems like it's almost the opposite, where they come out very, very slow and they kind of turn it up down the stretch. I would love for this to be a game where Purdue comes out, sets the tone, and dominates throughout. Chances are we probably won't see that necessarily, but I would love to see this be a convincing win over a Michigan State team that is reeling, and I don't know if they necessarily have done enough to even be an NCAA tournament team this year. So even though they are wearing the green and white of the traditional Michigan State teams, this is not a traditional Tom Izzo Michigan State team, and Purdue really needs to take advantage of that. And then later in the week, on the 20th, Purdue travels to Nebraska, who actually just got their first win of Big Ten play of the year. And I believe, if I saw correctly, it's their first Big Ten win since like January of 2020. It's like over a year of the Cornhuskers not having a single Big Ten win. They finally take down Penn State on the road by 162-61. This is another game that has given Purdue trouble in the past, and I'm not entirely sure why. That it really seems like this Purdue team plays down to its competition down the stretch, and this is a game that Purdue needs to come out and absolutely, especially with Trevion Williams, Zach Edey, Jaden Ivey, need to come out and just assert themselves early and kind of keep, put Nebraska away nice and early. This is also an interesting thing to keep an eye on because there have been talks about potentially trying to make up the Nebraska game that was postponed earlier in the year by doing a sort of doubleheader with Nebraska on back-to-back days. I think Nebraska is doing something similar with Maryland, if I take a look at their schedule quickly. Yes, so on the 16th and 17th on back-to-back days, they're taking on Maryland twice. So they're traveling to Maryland to take on their, I'm assuming, originally scheduled game on the 16th, and then they're going to stay, and then the next day on the 17th they're going to play again. So I don't know if this is necessarily going to happen because it looks as though there was a bit more of a gap between these Maryland games and the Purdue game. So the Penn State game was on the 13th, and then they had 2 days of rest, and then 16th and 17th they'll have 2 full days of rest, and then on the 20th they take on Purdue. So if they were to make up the game in a similar fashion, they would play Purdue again on the 21st, and then their next game would be against Illinois at Illinois on the 24th. So it could work, but man, this Nebraska team, if they really go down the stretch trying to make up all these games, they're going to be playing, I think I saw it was going to be like 11 games in 22 days or something like that. That is a bit much, and I doubt that happens. There haven't been any recent talks of making up the Nebraska game. as of yet. So I know it's still about a week out and things can shift and change. But at least as of right now, nothing official has happened. But that has kind of been, the talks going forward. So that is, the immediacy of this week. In my eyes, Purdue really needs to go 2-0 this week. They've kind of literally been up and down in their last 5 games, going 3-2 in that stretch, with their wins coming against Minnesota at home and Northwestern at home, and then their losses, 2 of which were extremely frustrating. Lose it down the stretches of at Maryland and at Minnesota, and then Michigan at home, which Michigan is very good this year, guys. I don't know if you saw their game against Wisconsin, but they are doing all right. But that is Purdue's basketball schedule this week, and it really, I think that kind of, this really needs to set the tone for this week. I know I just touched on it, but Purdue needs to go 2-0 this week to continue to solidify themselves as an NCAA tournament team and continue to fight for seeding, I think, more than anything, because a lot of places had them, right on that 5 line. I mean, even falling to a 6 line, I personally would feel better. I know it would be a bit hard to watch them, climb all the way up to a 5 seed and then fall back towards the end. But at the same time, that 5 seed I think it gives me some flashbacks to some times and as well as some other games. Whenever you watch the NCAA tournament, those 5-12 games, I think everyone at least tunes in the beginning to see, what that is going to be all about. And when it comes to this Purdue team, who really struggles to come out early and fast, could spell a lot of danger when it comes to that 5-12 matchup. So Purdue needs to come out 2-0 this week, continue to fight for seed lines, as well as continue to grow and learn in the Big Ten. And I think that wraps up kind of the now going forward. And I think I now want to at least touch on before we wrap up. This is going to be a pretty quick one, just because we only had 1 game this week and not a lot else has gone on. I will spend this time to give a special shout out to the Purdue Volleyball team, who went 2-0 at Michigan this week. This was Michigan's first 2 games of the season, and Purdue went on the road and finally got a couple of big top 25 wins for themselves, as they took down Michigan twice, I think both in 4 sets. And so that is a big boon for the women's volleyball team, who have been playing very well so far and has just come up short in their other matches, which I believe came against Wisconsin and someone else I can't remember off the top of my head. Wisconsin and Minnesota? I can't remember if it was Minnesota or not, but they came against teams who were ranked higher than Purdue, and they got swept in both of those. I think they won one. I really should have brushed up on this before I came on. But special shout out to the Purdue volleyball team, as they are really rounding into form as we get down towards the heart of their conference play. But for now, I think I want to touch a bit on something that I've talked about a lot on Twitter. And if you don't follow Boiler in Texas on Twitter, that is where most of my interaction goes, as well as the written content every once in a while on boilerinTexas.com. But I want to talk about these close games and kind of what they mean in the grand scheme of things for Purdue basketball. Obviously, these games are extremely frustrating to watch, especially when Purdue is the one who's leading down the stretch and then just don't make enough plays to, really hammer it home and really close it out. Extremely, extremely frustrating in the moment, and I think we can all agree that it is very, very hard to watch that happen, especially when it comes in almost back-to-back road games and almost back-to-back games where Purdue travels to Maryland, leads down the stretch, doesn't make enough plays, loses by 1. Travels to Minnesota, plays pretty well, not very well shooting-wise, but does enough to have a lead for a majority of the game and most of the second half. But then when it really comes down to crunch time, they hit a couple of lucky threes, and then all of a sudden Purdue wasn't able to build that 3 to 4 possession lead, in that constant state of up between 2 and 5, a couple of threes, and all of a sudden you're down 1 with 10 seconds left, looking for a basket to go and get the win. while extremely tough to watch and tough to swallow in the moment, this has been a consistent factor throughout this entire year. And I think that while it is frustrating now, it's important to remember that in the long term, this is going to be something that is going to teach this team and these young guys so much when it comes to finishing games or putting teams away early, that I honestly think in maybe as early as next year, maybe as late as 2 years from now, this group of guys is not going to be fazed by anything. And what I mean by that is, if a team could go on a 20-0 run, and I don't think this team is going to really blink in the face of that momentum swing, because playing in all of these close games and coming out on top in some of them, I think is really teaching this team, what it takes to be mentally tough, physically tough down the stretch, and really what it takes to close out games, both from a pulling it out and coming out on top, a la Michigan State, or falling behind and not doing enough at the end, a la at Maryland or at Minnesota. So these games, while extremely frustrating in the moment, if you take a step back and kind of look at the situation as a whole, I think this is one of the most important things that could happen to an extremely young team. These guys aren't getting blown out by 20 every game. These guys aren't winning by 20 every game. They're going through it in a season which feels so weird, that playing in all of these close games now, you get the sense that once they grow into it a bit, and especially next year when they get to take that next leap after having this entire season under their belt, I think it is going to be extremely fun to watch. And I don't think there will be very many close games in a few years. Either Purdue is just going, I don't think there's going to be many blowout losses in the coming years. I think it's going to either be a solid Purdue win, or it's going to go down to the wire. And this team is going to be so experienced and know what it's like to go down to the wire that they're going to immediately be able to remember back to these games and know that, all right, they're going to hopefully think to themselves, we've been in this situation before. We know what not to do. We've learned from it. Here's what we need to do. Let's go do it, and then just go and get it done. So I think this is going to be extremely helpful down the stretch, while extremely frustrating now. As I touched on in the previous episode, and if you haven't listened to that, you should go back and listen to that, because I kind of touched on Purdue season up to last week, and kind of, I think I also spent a bit of time, or I know I spent a bit of time defining success and what success means to this team this season, in this weird mixed up season that we are already having. And in that, I talked about, and I'll touch the highlights here, is at the beginning of the season, I don't think many people were expecting us to compete for a Big Ten title, or were expecting us to compete for a top 3 finish in the Big Ten. And what Purdue has done over the course of the year has shifted our expectations of and what we define success as we've gone. And so even using last week as a touch point, the expectation was to go on the road in the Big Ten and get a win at Minnesota, in which at the beginning of the season, if you were to say, okay, go on the road in the Big Ten with as many freshmen and as inexperienced players as Purdue has and get a win against a solid, not amazing, but not terrible Minnesota team, I think a lot of people would have looked at you kind of a little apprehensively, with the thought of, if Purdue gets the win, that's great, amazing, but if Purdue loses, I think that's kind of what we were expecting. But as the season has gone on, and we've seen what Minnesota's done, we've seen what Purdue has been able to achieve, all of a sudden losing in Minnesota, especially the way Purdue lost at Minnesota, it becomes a bit more disappointing. But I think if you take a step back in a grand scheme of things, Purdue's 13-8 has a handful of pretty great wins, been able to tough out a lot of great wins. Those 2 wins over Ohio State all of a sudden are looming about as large as they can. Ohio State is ranked in the top 5 in the country, and Purdue has the season sweep against them this season. This team has so much potential that they just need a little bit more experience and game experience to be able to put it together consistently. I think that's the biggest thing we're seeing now, is just a lack of consistency. And I think that also comes from, I'm not going to say a lack of upperclassmen leadership, but a group of upperclassmen that were thrust into a leadership role more than take on it naturally. It's also, again, not to make this as an excuse, but Sasha Stefanovic, who has been one of the more important players for this team, is still coming back from being out from having COVID. And so he's definitely still working back into the swing of things. And I think down the stretch, his time off is also going to help this team, these young guys who all of a sudden got a little bit more run. Jaden Ivey, I think, has taken a giant leap forward in these recent weeks, especially with Sasha being out. He was kind of thrust into a bit more of a scoring role. But once Sasha comes back and they're able to work all of that back in, I think Sasha definitely adds a level of complexity and leadership to this team that was very, very missed out on the court. You can be a leader off the court from the bench, but what I think teams really need is that guy to be on the floor, be able to do stuff in the moment as well as contribute himself. And I think Sasha brings that tenfold. And so once he gets going again, I think this team will start to gel again as we near the end of the season, and then hopefully pick it back up and be peaking right around the end of the season. And I think that they could definitely do it. I think they could also continue to be this very up and down team that we've kind of seen all season. That also is just as likely. But I believe that as this team continues to play these close games and work Sasha back into it, I think they're going to come down the stretch and be a very confident team and a very, very dangerous team for whoever ends up drawing them, either in the Big Ten tournament or in the NCAA tournament. I do still believe Purdue makes the NCAA tournament. I don't think it's very close. I think they make it pretty comfortably. I think at this point they're playing for seeding more than anything, as well as to avoid some of the major teams on their quadrant of the bracket. So that, I think, will wrap up this relatively quick Runaway Train Sports podcast. Purdue having only one game this week definitely contributes to that. If you have any suggestions or topics you'd like me to cover, keep an eye out on Twitter at Boiler in Texas. I believe on Sunday mornings, and then again on Sunday afternoons, I will send out a request for any topics or questions that you might have and want me to cover. So keep an eye out for that, and you can drop those on Twitter, or you can find the Runaway Train Sports Podcast homepage on boilerinTexas.com. You can find this podcast wherever you're currently listening, as well as most major podcasting hosts, as well as the video version on YouTube on the Boiler in Texas YouTube account. But for now, that will do it for me this week. Purdue has a big week ahead. I think a great chance to regain some momentum, go 2-0 this week. At minimum, go 1-1. If they lose to Michigan State, that's very disappointing, but I hope to God we do not lose to Nebraska. That will wrap it up this week. Join me again next Monday for episode 16 of the Runaway Train Sports Podcast. And like I said, keep an eye out on Twitter if you have any topics or questions you'd like me to cover. But for now, I'll wrap it up for me here. I'll see you guys next week. And as always, boiler up, hammer down, hail Purdue.